Jack had been on the road for days, riding through the dusty plains of the American West. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the earth beneath his horse's hooves into a dry, cracked mess. The cowboy wasn't exactly lost, but he didn't know exactly where he was heading. All he knew was that he was far from anyone who knew his name. He preferred it that way. For years he had been running from his past, trying to forget the things that haunted him. The people he loved were gone, and now all he had was his horse, his rifle, and his unspoken pain. Jack was used to being alone. It was safer that way. No one could get close to him, and that was exactly how he liked it. He spent his days riding through the vast empty land, always moving, always avoiding the memories that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But that afternoon something felt different. There was an eerie silence in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was a feeling that made him uneasy, and that was something Jack was not used to. He had been riding for hours when he came across a small, hidden camp near the edge of the forest. There were no roads here, just a small creek running through the trees. Jack's first instinct was to keep riding, to avoid any unnecessary encounters. But something about the camp caught his eye. There were a few horses tied up and a fire still smoldering. The camp was alive with the sounds of quiet voices and the occasional crackle of the firewood. Jack's curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to investigate. He slowed his horse as he approached the camp, staying hidden in the shadows of the trees. What he saw made him pause. A group of men stood around a woman, their voices low and angry. The woman was trying to break free from their grasp, but the men held her firm. Jack couldn't hear their words, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Without thinking, Jack kicked his horse into a trot, riding closer to the group. His hand instinctively went to the grip of his pistol, but he didn't draw it. He didn't know what was happening, but he didn't like the look of it. As he got closer, the men turned, surprised by his sudden appearance. The woman's eyes flicked towards him, and Jack felt a strange pull in his chest. There was something about her that made his heart race. "Who's this?" one of the men asked, his voice rough and threatening. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the woman. She was striking, with sharp features and long black hair that cascaded down her back. Her eyes were full of defiance, and despite the fear she felt, she stood tall as though she would not break. Jack could tell she wasn't from around here. The way she carried herself, the clothes she wore, they were different from what he was used to seeing. She was Apache, he realized, her heritage clear in the way she moved and spoke, even though her words were lost in the tension of the moment. Jack's gaze returned to the men. They looked uneasy now, no longer so sure of themselves. He could see the way they gripped their weapons, the way they glanced at each other nervously. They were used to being the ones in control, but Jack's presence had shifted the balance. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going anywhere, not without answers. "Let her go," Jack said, his voice steady. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The men looked at each other, uncertain whether to stand down or not. The woman, however, seemed to sense something in Jack's voice. Her eyes softened and she took a step forward, her hands still bound by rough ropes. "Please," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Don't leave me." The words were simple, but the desperation in her voice struck something deep within him. Jack was taken aback. He had never expected her to speak to him directly, and certainly not like that. There was something raw in her plea, something real. He could see the strength in her even as she stood vulnerable in front of him. She wasn't begging for herself, but for the chance to be free. Jack's heart softened in response, even though he tried to keep his distance. The men laughed, their confidence returning as they saw Jack's hesitation. "What's this? You think you can tell us what to do?" One of them sneered. But Jack's hand tightened around the reins, his jaw set in determination. "I'm telling you to let her go," he repeated, his voice colder this time. The men's laughter faltered, and for a moment there was silence. Jack knew they were weighing their options, deciding whether to fight or to leave. He didn't know who they were or what they wanted with her, but he wasn't about to let them hurt her. The tension was thick in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jack was ready to make his move, to draw his gun if he had to. But before he could act, the woman spoke again. "Please, don't leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Her eyes were locked on his, pleading with him as though she knew something he didn't. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what she was asking for, protection, help, maybe just a moment of kindness in a world that had been cruel to her. The men were starting to grow impatient. They were used to getting what they wanted, and now that Jack was in their way, they were becoming more aggressive. But Jack stood his ground, unwilling to let them take her. The cowboy wasn't used to feeling this kind of pull. He had never been the type to get involved in someone else's problems, but something about this woman, about her eyes and her words, made him feel like he had no choice. He could walk away like he always did, or he could step in, take a risk, and maybe change everything. "All right," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "I'll help you." And with that, everything changed. The days following the rescue were filled with uncertainty. Jack and Tala, he had learned her name, rode together in silence at first. Tala's hands were still bound, but Jack had freed her as soon as the men were gone. She hadn't said much at first, just thanked him quietly. He could tell she was grateful, but there was something else in her eyes, something that spoke of pain, of burdens too heavy to carry alone. She wasn't the type to share her troubles, not easily at least. They didn't speak much that night either. Jack set up a fire, his usual routine, and they sat by it, both lost in their thoughts. Tala had her back turned to him, staring out into the dark wilderness. Her posture, though quiet, spoke volumes. She wasn't just another woman in need of saving. She had a fire inside her, a strength that Jack could see now, and yet she had chosen to be vulnerable in front of him, even if just for a moment. He respected that. He didn't know what to do with his feelings. The cowboy in him wanted to keep his distance, wanted to tell her to go back to her tribe and never look back. He didn't need the complications that came with helping someone. But then, every time he thought about leaving, he thought about the way she had looked at him, pleading, begging him not to leave her. The desperation in her eyes had somehow changed him, and he hated himself for it. As the days passed, they grew more comfortable with each other, though neither of them ever voiced the truth. They were both survivors, trying to get by in a world that had been anything but kind to them. Jack had learned that Tala was a member of the Apache tribe, and her people were facing great hardship. Her father, the chief, had been gravely injured in a skirmish with a rival tribe, and the tribe was in disarray. Tala had been sent out on a mission to find help, but the men who had surrounded her earlier were her own people, not enemies. She had been caught in the middle of her tribe's struggle for survival. She didn't know if they would welcome her back or see her as a failure. Jack didn't know much about Apache customs, but he could tell that Tala carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. It wasn't just her father's injuries that weighed on her. It was the entire tribe's survival. She was torn between her duty and her desire to escape the violence that seemed to surround her every day. One evening, after they had traveled for hours, Jack finally spoke up. "Where are we headed?" His voice broke the silence, and Tala turned her head, glancing at him for the first time in a long while. "I don't know," she replied softly. "Back to the tribe, I suppose, but..." Her voice trailed off as she looked away, her gaze distant. "I'm not sure I belong there anymore." Jack nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had never truly belonged anywhere either. It was why he had been wandering for so long. He had given up trying to find a place where he felt like he fit in. But maybe, just maybe, things were different now. He didn't know why, but he felt a pull to help her, to give her the chance she needed to find peace. But what did that mean for him? The next few days passed in a blur. They traveled through difficult terrain, desolate hills, dry riverbeds, and rocky paths that stretched for miles. Jack didn't mind. He had learned to endure hardship, and he could see Tala growing stronger with each step they took. She was no longer the fragile woman he had rescued that day. Her resilience showed in the way she carried herself, in the way she dealt with each new challenge. She had a quiet strength that impressed him, and he found himself relying on her more and more. But just when Jack thought they were getting somewhere, just when he began to believe that they could both find the freedom they so desperately sought, they were forced to stop. They reached a small creek, and Jack suggested they rest for the night. He knew they couldn't keep riding forever. He wanted to ask more about Tala's life, about her tribe, about what had happened to her family, but he didn't want to push her. He knew that some things took time, and he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the full truth of her struggles. As the sun began to set, they sat together by the creek. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was calming, but the silence between them was heavy. Jack glanced at Tala, who had her arms wrapped around her knees, staring down at the water. She had changed since the day they met. She no longer appeared fearful, but there was still something in her eyes, a sadness that Jack couldn't quite understand. "Are you all right?" Jack asked, his voice quieter this time. Tala didn't look up. Instead, she took a deep breath before answering. "I don't know," she said. "Everything's changed. My father. He was supposed to lead us, but now—" Her voice cracked and she stopped herself. She seemed ashamed to show any weakness, but Jack could see through it. She was strong, but that didn't mean she wasn't carrying a heavy load. "You don't have to go back if you don't want to," Jack said, more to himself than to her. "You can stay with me. You don't have to face it alone." Tala finally looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, Jack thought she might turn him down, that she would refuse his offer and continue on her way. But instead, she stood up slowly, dusting off her clothes. "I can't run forever," she said softly, "but I'm not ready to face them, not yet. I need time. I need to find myself before I go back." Jack nodded, understanding her decision. He wasn't sure where this path would lead them, but he knew it was one they both had to take. For now, they would face the future together, one day at a time. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding peace, and maybe, just maybe, about finding each other. As they settled down for the night, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The cowboy had never been one for attachments, but Tala was different. She had changed something in him, and he didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in years, he didn't mind the uncertainty. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something new. And as they lay side by side, the fire crackling between them, Jack realized that the woman he had saved had already begun to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he was no longer running. For the first time in a long time, he had someone to fight for.